Welcome to Helping Children Heal from Trauma and Loss. We decided to put this talk together for parents because we just really wanted to get the word out to help parents understand just how trauma affects children and adolescents, and also opportunities to support your kiddos in their healing. My name is Dr. Ally Burr-Harris. I'm the director of our Child Trauma and Attachment program here at Children's Program, and this is Dr. Karina Peters and Dr. Julia Rossi. They are both completing their psychology residency, and happy to say they're staying on board with us at Children's Program and part of our trauma team. So without further ado, we'll just launch into some of the material we're hoping to cover with you guys. And what do we mean by trauma? I think that's a word that's overused sometimes, and I think people can use it as high level of stress that a child or adolescent may go through. When you think about the pandemic, all of us have been through something pretty traumatic in the last couple of years. The good news is that doesn't mean that all of us are showing up with PTSD or trauma-related symptoms. But really, a lot of what leads to trauma symptoms has to do with a lot of different variables. So we have a host of different kinds of trauma, ranging from bullying all the way to sexual assault or the traumatic loss of a loved one, or war, or refugee trauma, also the racial trauma, and physical abuse and emotional abuse. So there's a wide array of types of trauma that could affect a child. But a lot of it also depends on variables like, has that child had previous trauma experience? How violent was the trauma? Is it chronic trauma versus an acute episode or episodic trauma? Is it controlled or unpredictable? And also, is it interpersonal? Because we definitely know that trauma, particularly trauma that is happening at the hands of someone that's supposed to be protecting a child, is experienced as much more traumatic. And then also, what is that child bringing into the situation in terms of their vulnerabilities? Is this a child who already struggled with anxiety or emotional regulation issues, or had developmental delays or language-related difficulties, which could potentially impact how they're processing the experience or able to seek out help and make meaning of what they've been through. So the good news is that even though as many as 2/3 of youth experience a trauma by the age of 16, only 16% of them go on to develop PTSD. And one thing that we know for sure, and this will be emphasized throughout our talk, is that children heal in the context of relationships, and that a very, very important predictor of how children cope with trauma is the level of buffering that they have because of important relationships. So we would all be quite burnt out and probably not here if we didn't get to bear witness to the resilience of children and the power of healing. And that's a perk of our job, is we get to witness that every day. So we thought it might be helpful to try to frame this in examples. So we came up with some examples that I think can maybe help you picture how trauma can look different. And I'll turn it over to Julia.
So first, the first category that we'll cover is acute trauma. And when we're talking about acute trauma, we're talking about a single or discrete event or traumatic event. And so examples of that might be a natural disaster, or an assault, or a car accident, or a school shooting. So a kind of moment in time or single event. And when we're looking at trauma healing and ability to kind of move through an acute trauma, there are several positive adjustment factors or predictive of positive adjustment to the trauma that we found. So one of these are that kind of strong relational support with the family, with one's community, within one's culture, or a strong attachment to a parent or caregiver. We also see positive coping and sort of a history of ability to handle stress as predictive of positive adjustment to trauma. And as Ally mentioned, the nature of the trauma itself can impact a child's chances from being able to sort of positively adjust. If it's predictable or seen as a kind of controllable event for the child, that's associated with more chances of a child being able to kind of heal quicker from a trauma. If it's moderate in severity, and if it's not relational, as Ally mentioned, if it isn't within the context of another person committing the act that is traumatic to the child. And then we also see if a child is able to kind of process or make meaning of the trauma, either through play or art, through conversation with trusted adults, and also through kind of rituals or actions or advocacy. So something we saw with the teens in the Parkland shooting who were able to sort of advocate for gun control measures. These types of abilities to sort of make meaning can really impact a child's ability to sort of heal from trauma. And then we also see, particularly with like natural disasters is a good example, if we're able to sort of get the child back into a predictable daily routine quickly, then they're better able to sort of adjust and heal and kind of move through. So we're going to share a vignette, as Ally mentioned, that sort of illustrates a trauma in these kind of different categories for different children. So our vignette involves 3 ninth graders in a classroom. And one thing we wanted to mention sort of as we go through this is some of the information that we're going to be sharing and some of the examples are can be pretty heavy or can elicit a strong response, particularly if you've experienced trauma yourself. As Ally mentioned, many of us have. So we encourage you to sort of pause and take a step away or do whatever you need to do to be able to cope if this brings up kind of strong emotions. So in our vignette, that being said, there are 3 ninth graders who are in the same classroom. I'll be talking about the first ninth grader, Jesse. And in this example, their classmate, Carlos, dies by suicide with a gun in the school bathroom. Jesse has strong relational support, including a close relationship with his parents and his girlfriend and his church community. Jesse does not have a history of other traumatic losses except the death of his elderly and dearly loved grandmother. Jesse has some mild learning challenges but has the support that he needs in place. They already have a therapist involved who has helped him with issues around dyslexia, and Jesse was close to Carlos and will need support in healing from the traumatic loss, but all indicators point to resilience and healing with time. Jesse is tearful at school and at home. He's not able to focus for the first several weeks after the trauma, and he needs to stay home a couple of days. He struggles at first to reminisce about Carlos because all he can think about is the circumstances around Carlos's death. He shows some avoidance initially, but with the support of his parents and his therapist, he's able to put together a slideshow and a poem about his friend Carlos and share it at the memorial service. He also organizes a school run to raise money for suicide prevention in Carlos's honor. So we encourage you to maybe pause and reflect on some of the positive protective factors for Jesse's healing that you may have noticed in this vignette. And then we'll move to the next one.
So our second ninth grader is going to be an example of what we would call chronic trauma. So I'm going to read the vignette first and then go into what chronic trauma definitionally is. So Isabella is also in Carlos's class. Isabella's family fled from El Salvador due to violence. Before leaving, her teenage brother was killed in front of her when she was 7. She and her parents sought asylum in the United States, and Isabella spent time in a foster home shortly after because her parents were detained by immigration services. Eventually, they were reunited and experienced a time of stability as a family. There's a great deal of love and connection in their family, and they have a close Spanish-speaking neighborhood community. Last year, her father was deported because he had outstanding warrants. The family lost their apartment and had to move into a shelter briefly. Isabella is now babysitting after school to help the family with money, and they just moved into a new apartment. She misses her father terribly. She was not close friends with Carlos, but he was the only other Latino student in her class. She worries that others will assume she is unstable emotionally because of their shared culture. She wants counseling support at school, but her mom worries that it will jeopardize Isabella's chance of getting into college, and her mother feels it is best to just look forward and carry on. Isabella's academic performance drops after Carlos's death. She is visibly sad and more reactive with others. She acknowledged to her teacher that she's not getting enough sleep because of nightmares. She has frequent stomach aches and visits to the nurse's office. And so, as we're thinking about Isabella specifically and her experience of the death of her classmate Carlos, it's with everything that has happened in her life, it's a good example of chronic trauma. Definitionally, trauma that is chronic is extreme, violent, interpersonal, unpredictable, and prolonged. Oftentimes it's repeated, and it's a lot harder to recover from and heal from. What I want to make sure that we note in chronic trauma is that when the trauma is ongoing, prolonged, and repeated, it makes it a lot more difficult to heal from. And we can only then rely on our survival skills in the same way Isabella had to rely on her survival skills. That said, what Ally said a little bit earlier is that we need that safe relationship to be the foundation to begin healing, which is a lot more difficult when you're experiencing a chronic trauma because it's repeated and ongoing. One of the studies I want to make sure that I mention under the umbrella of chronic trauma is the ACEs study. So the ACEs study looked at adverse childhood experiences, and what it found was that the more adverse childhood experiences that you have, the higher your risk of physical diseases, mental health issues, etc. An example of a health problem that has been linked to childhood adverse experiences is alcohol abuse, substance abuse, increased suicidal ideation, even cancer, depression, etc. So what this study found is that it increases your risk for all of these things.
I will talk some about early childhood trauma and give an example from the class that Carlos was in as well with our third kiddo. And I'll speak a little bit about early childhood trauma, and I think there's still a bit of a myth in our culture that if you don't remember the trauma, it doesn't have as much impact on you. Unfortunately, that is actually the opposite, that trauma that occurs perinatal, meaning 0 to 2 months of life, or in early childhood, really up until the age of 6, has the most detrimental impact on long-term outcome, particularly for those children that don't have the protection of safe relationships. And in fact, if you look at Bruce Perry's research, that and this is staggering to me, that they looked at level of trauma exposure and to what degree children had protection of relationships, and they found more detrimental outcome for children that had low relationship support and high trauma in the first 2 months of life. And even if they went on to then have good support and minimal trauma, they were still more at risk for negative outcome than children that had the creme de la creme start for the first 2 months and then had 12 years of adversity or abuse. So, that's pretty staggering when you think about that. And for children that have early developmental trauma, because their brain is developing at that time, and we will get into that in a couple of minutes, they are at risk of their stress response system getting stuck, where they are constantly in overdrive and looking out for danger. Also, like what Julia was talking about, part of how we heal is making meaning of a trauma. If you don't have memory of the trauma, it's very difficult to make meaning of it. You just have it in your bones. Here's an example that should illustrate this. So Fiona is in Carlos's class as well. Fiona has a loving relationship with her parents and a strong community of support. Fiona is also a gifted athlete. However, Fiona was adopted at age 3 from a Russian orphanage. Her first 3 years included profound deprivation, malnutrition, and institutional care. Fiona had 2 corrective surgeries for a birth defect before age 3 as well, and another surgery after her adoption. It is assumed she was alone in the hospital for her first 2 operations. Fiona is well-liked socially, but is drawn to a rough group of peers. She has ADHD, and she requires significant early intervention, or she did require significant early intervention for gross motor and language delays post-adoption. She is now on an IEP. She has a history of big emotional meltdowns at home, but she holds it together well at school in terms of classroom behavior. In fact, at school, she tends to withdraw or space out when stressed. After Carlos's death, Fiona stops participating altogether in class. She has an accident of wetting herself because she won't go in the bathroom at all now at school. She started cutting class, and parents recently learned that she was vaping. She also posted a picture of her having cut her wrists. Fiona denies any distress related to Carlos's death and says she hardly knew him. She refuses to meet with a therapist. So encourage you to pause there and think about some of the risk factors that you're hearing that potentially make processing of this acute trauma much more challenging, not just for Fiona, but also for Isabella. Yeah, Isabella. Okay. So now we launch into talking about the brain, which Julia and Karina would attest to the fact that I get a little giddy talking about brain development and trauma. And so y'all will time me and cut me off if I go too long, right? First thing that is really important to understand is your brain is developing at a massive rate at the beginning of life, in utero, as well as in the first 3 years of life. And to bring that on home, that you can look at this graph, which reflects it. But the greatest period of brain development is in utero, and brain development takes up 70% of the newborn's calories versus 18% in adults. The baby has 99.9% of their neurons at birth, and 20,000 new neurons each second are exploding, compared to, sadly, just 700 new neurons in a day for an adult. So in the first 3 years of your life, your brain develops to 90% of the adult size, with the majority of the systems and the structure that we need in place for all future emotional, behavioral, social, and physiological functioning during the rest of your life. So the other thing to keep in mind in terms of the neurobiology of trauma is that our brain organizes from the bottom up and from the inside out, okay? So we have sensory input that comes in, whether that's through our 5 senses outside of us: sight, smell, hearing, taste, touch, okay? Or also like what we experience internally, like hunger or thirst or a cramp in our leg, or dropping something on our toe. I guess that's touch, okay? So anyway, because that sensory input is coming in through the bottom of our brain, and because our lower part of our brain is our most primitive part of our brain. In fact, people tend to call it the lizard brain or your reptilian brain or your downstairs brain. It has lots of nicknames. But as a result, the thinking part of the brain is the last to get the message. And so if we are interpreting something as dangerous, then our lower part of our brain can respond to that before our upper part of our brain has a chance to turn off that alarm and say, nah, it's not a snake next to your canoe, it's really just a stick. But meanwhile, your heart has already started racing, you're paddling like crazy, you're probably screaming, and then your brain tells you it's just a stick. You can tell I grew up in the South near a river. I think probably the easiest way to make sense of this, and you have a slide that shows the hand model of the brain, but I'm going to show it as well, because I think this is something you can teach your kids as well. And in fact, your kids may have already been taught this at school, because a lot of teachers have gotten pretty savvy that this is a good way to help kids understand the way that their brain works. So this is a crude example, and any neurologists in the audience, feel free to correct me if I make any structural errors here. So if you imagine that you're looking back, this is from Dan Siegel, and it's called The Hand Model of the Brain. You can find it on YouTube as well. So if you imagine that here's your eyes right here, and you're looking into the back of your head, this is that lower part of the brain. This is your brain stem, this is your midbrain, and this is your limbic system, your thumb that's tucked in here, and then this is your cortex, okay? Your neo-orbital frontal cortex is right there in the front, right behind the eyes. That's kind of the CEO that is kind of the boss of the brain, right? So when we're regulated, our thinking part of our brain is integrating everything and able to tell that alarm, no biggie, we got this, all's well, right? When our limbic system detects danger from that sensory input, now keep in mind, we just gave examples of children that have experienced trauma. If they have a heightened stress response, that means the lower part of their brain is primed to look for danger. So their amygdala, which is basically the smoke detector or the alarm in your brain, is much more trigger happy and much more likely to say, emergency. And so then it's kind of like a spring. So your cortex gets a little hijacked here, because let's face it, if a lion came in this room right now, we would not be using our cortex. We'd be throwing chairs, we'd be screaming, we'd be doing all kinds of things, but we wouldn't be stopping and saying, I wonder if that's a domesticated lion, or did it escape from the zoo? But we would not be using our cortex. We would be full on, flipping our lid, because we don't need to use that, and that's a waste of energy, right? Then if we discovered it was our boss in a costume, our cortex would turn the alarm off, and we would think, wow, that was a really cruel trick, right? So, and then you have these chemicals, and y'all have heard of them: adrenaline, cortisol, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine. And without going into too much of a complicated explanation, that's kind of like a sprinkler system that's coming on and sending like amped up heart rate. And you can imagine that for kids that have that elevated cortisol and they're going through life like that because they don't have the sense that they're safe, this is why those are kids that have the ACEs scores where they're more at risk, because to live your life jacked up on cortisol puts you at significant risk for other health problems. So I'll say a couple more things about this just because I think it's interesting. So your amygdala is in your limbic system. Also, your hippocampus is in your limbic system. Your hippocampus is important because it's kind of like the librarian of your brain. It's like your cognitive mapper that tells your memories where to go in the library. There's 2 times that the hippocampus falls down on the job. One of them is in the first 2 years of life, and that's simply because it hasn't fully developed enough yet, which is why we don't have an autobiographical memory that we can share about our early childhood. We have memories. They're just kind of stored in our body, and we can't consciously access them because our librarian didn't put them where we know where to look in the library. The other time that the hippocampus falls down on the job, though, is in times of very high stress, which is why traumatic memories tend to not get stored in a way where we can kind of file them in the back of the library. So a lot of our trauma work is helping people make meaning of the trauma enough so that they can store it in the library so that they're not tripping up over it every time they come in. So the other thing, in terms of the hierarchy of brain function, so we have brainstem, midbrain, limbic system, cortex. Your brainstem is pretty much done developing by the time you're a baby, okay? And midbrain by age 2. Limbic system by age 6. I will pause and let you ponder a second as to when your cortex is done developing. There's the pause. But there's no audience here, so we'll just give you the answer. 25. So parents, sadly, most of you, your brain is done maturing. You can still learn things, but your cortex is not going to be growing and maturing anymore. But the good news is that when you're freaking out about, oh my gosh, my kid did this at age 8, what are they going to do when they're 17? That a lot of that, you have to remember their cortex is not even half cooked. And their cortex is the part of the brain that problem solves, makes meaning, puts on the brakes, helps with time management, helps, like, is this a good idea or a bad idea? So 8-year-old meltdown does not mean 25-year-old murderer. So if you look at the next slide that shows the scans, it kind of brings home just how detrimental early trauma is to brain development. The brain that you see on the right side is a child that had extreme neglect. And you will see that this child has enlarged ventricles and cortical atrophy, and the actual head circumference is only at the 3rd percentile. We can make some recovery up until age 4, but when someone has very profound neglect, particularly sensory deprivation, where they're not getting exposed to language, and malnutrition, understimulation, no touch, that can causes permanent brain damage. There's plenty of facts I could give in terms of how, like trauma affects the brain. I would say that some of the most consistent research findings are that children with early trauma have an enlarged amygdala, and also a smaller corpus callosum. That's that part of the brain that helps the left and the right work together. Also lower intracranial and cerebral volume, elevated stress hormones, like 3 times higher PEA, high cortisol, low serotonin. And interestingly, when they've done a lot of the research in terms of early trauma on Romanian orphanages, actually, and they found that the size of the amygdala is actually proportional to how long a child is in institutional care. So the other thing that, I think this is a compelling statistic, that if you think about toxic lead poisoning, which is something that we know is detrimental to brain development with children early on in life, it's actually, when you compare high levels of domestic violence versus high levels of lead poisoning, the high levels of domestic violence has more than twice the amount of brain impact for young children under the age of 3. Lead poisoning has been overall a loss of 3 IQ points, and domestic violence exposure overall is a loss of 8 IQ points for children under the age of 3. So, and then I did include, this is from a book called What Happened to You by Bruce Perry, this chart that shows different states from calm all the way to terror, and it shows you different parts of the brain that tend to be in the driver's seat. There are two different kind of trends in response to trauma or really stress that people can take. They can either go the hyper arousal or they can go the hypo arousal. Hypo arousal is more when you, at a smaller level, might be trying to kind of please someone if you felt in danger, and that could move towards collapse or numbing out or dissociation, checking out. That is more common with females, with young children, with medical trauma, or with traumas that you can't escape, such as being sexually trafficked, something like that, or kidnapped. So hyperarousal is probably what you think of more often when you think of a trauma response. That's when you tend to go into fight, flight, or freeze. We tend to, what Bruce Perry calls flock. That's when you get kind of vigilant, like, what was that noise, And then you might move to the freeze, kind of like the deer in the street. Bad survival skill for the deer there. But, and then you would move to flight if you thought you could get away, and fight if you couldn't. So the hyperarousal tends to be more common for traumas where you have some kind of action involved in it, or if you're an observer, or if you're a male, or if you're an older kid. And then I'm going to turn it over to Karina because I'm done talking about the brain.
So as Ally so eloquently explained, depending on the type of trauma that you experience, that does have a massive impact on how you respond to those traumas. In the same way, trauma symptoms vary across childhood as well. So in this first slide, you'll see the most common responses, trauma symptoms for kids from 0 to 5 years old. And the ones that I especially want to point out is in the attachment problems, is difficulty to soothe or clingy behavior, such as following parents around the house or excessive crying that is out of the ordinary. In contrast, it can also look like withdrawal or avoidance of physical contact. A big one for this age range as well is unusual regression. So what that means is losing a skill they previously were able to do. So that sometimes might look like not being able to sit anymore or crawl anymore when they used to be able to do that, or loss of being socially engaged and playful with you, or if new problems emerge, such as not having a good night's sleep anymore, not eating well, those kinds of things. Another one that's common from 0 to 5 years old is frozen watchfulness, so appearing numb, cut off, avoiding eye contact, and physical complaints with no cause, so tummy ache, a headache, and feeling tired. But there's a laundry list for you to see on this slide. On the next slide, we have 6 to 12-year-olds. The most common trauma symptoms that we see for them are within the school system and socially. So this might look like school refusal, having behavior problems, poor school performance, inability to concentrate, and distractibility is a big one. Oftentimes this will get mixed up for ADHD when it might be something trauma related, as well as in therapy or just in play, recreating the traumatic event with their peers. Emotionally, you might see a lack of self-confidence, increased loneliness, frequent confusion or clinginess, and again, physical problems. So they might have somatic complaints, which is basically things that manifest in the body. So stomach aches, feeling tired, not eating as much, and maybe nightmares that they're reporting as well. And our last laundry list of age group for trauma symptoms is 13 to 18. So as you know, looks very different than 6 to 12-year-olds. So for this age range, I want us to focus specifically, if you look at the slide, on the relational and social problems. You'll also see school problems, but it might look completely different than the 6 to 12. So maybe it looks like starting fights or trouble relating to peers, risky behaviors, so trying substances, or what parents might call getting in with the wrong crowd, as well as emotionally, they might isolate, might be increasingly angry for what might seem like no reason at all, have more verbal aggression, and then as we said with the last two, age ranges, physical problems, so stomach aches, headaches. That's the one that is pretty much the same across all ages. And so thinking about everything that Ally just explained to us about the brain, our vignettes, and the symptoms, and what she had said at the very beginning, I want to bring us back to, which is we can heal through relationships. And that is the most important thing to think about when we're thinking about how bleak all of this might sound. Humans are emotionally contagious. If we pay attention to our own regulatory internal storm and how it might be impacting the climate of others, it will then have a ripple effect on the people around you. And so relationships is the number one predictor of how a child can cope with stress. Our brains are organized to have the capacity to heal through rhythm and patterns and consistency and stability, specifically through the interactions of relationships. So that's awesome, and it's a good, promising thing. I have a note here that says that the most powerful form of reward is relational, which means even more relational or even more rewarding than drugs. So that's a big deal. And so when we think about this, what we think about like healthy relationships, arguably one of the most important parts is attunement. And so on the slide in front of you has a small definition of attunement and two pictures specifically of a parent with their child. And that is because we do this best with babies. When a baby reacts or opens their mouth or has their eyebrows up, you automatically respond the same way. And that is what attunement is. It is aligning your internal state with the state of your child. So reflecting their emotional state, mirroring what they're doing, all in nonverbal communication. As adults, this might look like calling up a friend on your drive home and saying, "Oh my gosh, my boss really made me mad today," and that friend responding with, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe him. That's so awful." And the inverse of that, which would be a lack of attunement, would be something like, "I can't believe that my boss did that." And the response being, "Oh, well, it's fine. I mean, you're overreacting. It wasn't really that bad." So attunement is foundational when we're thinking about healthy relationships and getting to that brainstem part of the brain, that nonverbal part of what might be dysregulating your child.
So you'll notice that we're kind of taking you through the ABCs, so to speak, of healing through relationships. So Karina's mentioned that first kind of critical step of attuning. One major part of attunement, as she hinted at, is that nonverbal communication. So we really wanted to kind of extract nonverbal communication because it's so important. And it's really a significant portion of our communication with other humans is nonverbal, yet it's often what we consciously attend to the least. So we're often more focused on what we're saying rather than how we're saying it. But the research really shows that particularly when a child's cortex is offline, as Ally talked us through, nonverbal communication can be even more powerful. If the cortex is offline, we're not really getting through with verbal input. So we have on this slide some examples of nonverbal communication that you can use to better attune to your child and demonstrate that care and that empathy and that presence and safety that Karina was mentioning with attunement. So with eye contact, important to make eye contact in the first place, right? If someone's telling you about their day, if your child comes home and they're really upset about something and you're on your phone and okay, sweetie, not making eye contact, that is a really powerful way of attuning to your child. Sort of, it says, "I see you," literally. Then we have, your facial expression, right? If you're scowling at your child or having sort of a resting expression of frustration or annoyance, that can send a completely different message than what we're meaning to send. Even if you're frustrated about something else, we can kind of wear it in our bodies and transmit that to our child. Tone of voice is really important. If you say like, "It's time for bed" versus "It's time for bed," that kind of tone makes a big difference. We can really use these forms of touch, of gesture, of sort of modulating the intensity of our response to non-verbally or paraverbally communicate that kind of attunement with our child. And then the B, so we've covered attunement. The B stands for balance. So you've attuned with your child, you've met them where they're at, you've assessed that they are dysregulated or they're in fight or flight. So now is time to help them regulate, help them kind of achieve that sense of safety and balance. So ways that, if we think about sort of if your child's fight or flight response is activated, we want to sort of reverse that response. We want to help them calm that alarm system when they're sort of dysregulated. So the first part of this is that our own regulation is crucial in this. So as I mentioned before, if we're sort of off kilter or we're escalated, which can happen when children are upset or when we're in a high stress environment, we're going to transmit that to our child and we're just going to go off the deep end with them. So it's really important that that you as parents are mindful of your own regulation and that you're calm and doing what you need to do to stay regulated in order to help your child regulate. There's several ways that we can do this with belly breathing is a common one that we like, that helps kind of reverse that. When we're in fight or flight, we're taking in more kind of shallow breaths and we're sending our heart rate up and we're prepared to fight or flee or freeze. And so in order to kind of reverse that, if we take in less, if we exhale for longer than we inhale, or if we send that breath into our bellies instead of our chests, we can help kind of slow down that heart rate and reverse that process and turn off that alarm system. One of the ways that we kind of naturally do this is through singing. We exhale for longer than we inhale, so that can be a fun one to use to help regulate your child. We can do muscle relaxation, positive self-talk, coming up with a mantra with your child of like, we got this, or we're okay, or we can handle this. And finding ways to distract can be a way to help regulate them or help them ground them in the present moment. One great resource for ways to help your child regulate through sensory is the Connected Therapist by Marty Smith. Offers lots of ways to assess kind of where your child's at in that response system and how to use sensory objects to help soothe them and help regulate them. And then the last piece that I want to mention is how important it is to be teaching these skills when your child is already calm versus introducing them when they're in full-blown crisis. If we think about the difference between offering your child a life preserver when they're already drowning versus teaching them swimming lessons in calm waters first and helping them to develop those skills themselves, it's the same thing that we want to do with regulation. We want to help our child regulate to the point where they learn those skills themselves, and later on down the road they can be using those regulation skills to help themselves.